I have one more, and this was an interesting writing. There was a private named Private Frederick Butcher, and the report that comes out was actually published in a newspaper years after the execution. But and he calls the Private Frederick Butcher, he calls him Jim, but this eyewitness to his execution wrote about it in a paper. I shall call him Jim. He had been out 3 years. He had been wounded, but he was wounded at a time when wounded were cared for in France and were back in the line in 6 weeks. There was nothing about Jim which attracted special attention. He was the average, happy-go-lucky sort of lad who did the day's work in the average way. War had become normal to him, and he had settled down to that fatalism which characterized so many of our men when they said, if it is to be, it will, and if it ain't, it won't. As if he had suddenly been hit in the mind, he stood stock still one night and point blank refused to go over with a raiding party. In an instant, he became a marked man. His comrades could not quite determine whether it was bravery or idiocy. Perhaps some string had snapped. Something somewhere had gone wrong. But Jim just refused. He was exceedingly nervous, but such a breach of discipline was in itself sufficient to account for that. By the time he stood on the mat before the court, he had partly regained his normal composure, but the seriousness of the situation had washed away the color from his face, and there was a dull leaden look in his blue eyes. His record saved him. It was good, and his judges tempered judgment with mercy and consideration. He had had many platoon commanders, many captains, and with all he had done his bit. The court gave him a chance. He made no excuse whatsoever, but when asked the question, he promised that it would not occur again. A week later, it did occur again, and the next court sentenced him to death. Blindfolded, with his hands tied behind him, he was to be shot at dawn the following day. From the death sentry, Jim learned the names of the officer and men who were to send him west next morning. They were all his friends. 2 or 3 officers who had known him for years went into the death hut and said goodbye. Somehow none of them could quite catalog Jim as a coward. Terrible things happen in war, but nothing perhaps is more terrible than to send one of your own out of life when you are not quite sure whether he is a coward or a martyr. The world will never know the real truth. There was no psychologist there to give an opinion. Even if there had been, it might not have altered the course of events. Discipline, even then, might have won an unfair victory over science. In the mechanism of Jim's mentality, a cog slipped and the wheels revolved irregularly. From what the CO and Jim's pals told me, I am fully persuaded that Jim died as a martyr to discipline. Jim was blindfolded. His hands were bound together behind him. As he stood there, calm and steady as a rock, the orders were given. "Goodbye, sir. Goodbye, boys," he said, just as if he were off on a 10-day furlough. There was no reply. The subaltern was choked with emotion, and the firing squad, as heart-rent as he, dared not reply. The sharp crack of a volley smothered sighs of relief from the squad, and all was over. All save laying him beneath the soil of France. And there, where Jim lies, there shall remain forever a little bit of England.